Hi, I'm Mike Bird, Deputy Principal and Lecturer in New Testament at Ridley College.
Dr. Michael Bird. Mike, good to see you. Welcome back to Exegetically Speaking.
David, it's great to be with you and all your listeners.
Your podcast last time was one of our most popular of the year, and I'm sure this one will be just as well because we've got a really great topic today. We're looking at Romans 13, verse 1. All right, let's say, Mike, that you were pastor of a parish church in Rhode Island or something like that back in 1776, and you got wind of this rebellion that was happening in the colonies against the British rule and authority. You've got the King James Bible there. You've got the authorized version, Romans 13, verse 1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. There is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. What do you do as a parish minister?
Well, I begin by affirming that Romans 13:1 is indeed relevant to the situation, and that we should all be good, loyal subjects of His Majesty George III and consider his enemies our enemies and fight for the crown.
So that includes all the Minutemen. That would include all of your neighbors, all your parishioners.
Well, no, I mean, that's my general inclination is to say, we should obey Romans 13 when the government is good. So when we are faced with good government, a government that is not despotic, when it is not making war against its own people, violating their rights that they've been granted, by God or by their own state legislators, then we should indeed obey the government. And, yes, there is a place and a time for protest, either non-violent civil disobedience or in extreme measures there is a time for uncivil disobedience. I'm not convinced that 1776 was the time for it. I probably would have been a loyalist if I was there in 1776.
You've been wearing red then instead of wearing the Minutemen colors.
Yeah, I know, I would have been wearing red. It goes with my hair. So, that's what I want to do. But, I mean, during the American War of Independence, Romans 13, that everyone be subject to governing authorities, this is one of the verses that was disputed. If you're a good Bible-believing Christian in 1776, but you believe in the American cause of independence against British rule, well, what do you do with Romans 13? And, the same problem was faced during the English Civil War, when King Charles I ended up getting his head cut off by Parliament. People had all sorts of discussions about Romans 13. Like, how can we fight the king? How can we kill the king? We're meant to submit to governing authorities. So, how does Romans 13 apply to a civil war or a revolution? There is a long history of discussion on this subject.
Yeah. So as you read this, okay, Romans 13:1, now we just read one verse because you got to keep reading in some ways to the whole sense of it. Part of what this is all about, what this podcast is about, is good exegesis, helping us understand good exegesis. You made the turn earlier that when government is good, that it is to be obeyed, submitted to, etc. But when it's not good, how does that determine when good and not good? When government is oppressing, is making war against its people, it's violating this. How is that decision come to?
Yeah, I think you've got to look at, does the government seek the best of its own people, or does it exist purely for the vanity and enrichment of the king and the king's favorites? Or you could say, in our modern language, does the government serve the people, or do they only serve the top 1%? Or do they only serve the top 20%? Is it the elite class looking after themselves? Or is this a government that is, however imperfectly, seeking the good of the people, protecting and promoting their own vested interests? So that's what you've got to have a consider. Now, there's a difference between a government that's good, a government that is near good, a government that's maybe, bad or incompetent, and then there's a government that is despotic. I'm not sure all of those governments need the citizens to take up arms and oust them simply because they've got a bad tax policy, or they've got the wrong view of trans rights, or they've got the wrong view of gun control. I don't think we necessarily need to take up arms against all. Normally, you can correct a government through peaceful means, through petition and protest, through elections, through making representations to a emperor, king, prime minister, president, or whatever it is. I think it's only in extreme cases that you need to take up arms against a government when it's despotic or malevolent in nature.
So what do you make of that idea that there is no authority, and here the particular word is exousia. There is no authority except from God. So when there is a despotic authority, are they really not a real authority? Or are they usurpers? How would you take that term exousia in that context, so power, in other words?
Yeah, you can say here that all authority only exists because God permits it. All government is a servant of God in some sense. Whether we're talking about Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, or, President Xi of China, all of these only exist because of the divine purpose. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be held accountable by their people and by God for how they act towards their own people. But government is not a necessary evil. It is a gift from God, because even bad government is better than no government. That's the basic thing. But what I find interesting, David, is what is said about government in the rest of the passage. Not simply that the fact that government is from God, therefore you should not rebel against it, but rather that government is God's servant. It's appointed by God. And this is what Romans 13 1-7 really emphasizes,
goes on
is
to
the
say
subordination.
that.
The subordination of government to God. It is a divine servant. So government is never given a free-for-all, a carte blanche to do and act as they like in any fashion, whether they're right-wing or left-wing. No government is absolute. And there are a few verses in the Bible that point out that sometimes wicked kings need to be dealt with. I think there's a verse in Proverbs that says, "And they made kings, but not through me." So there are some kings, some rulers who have exceeded the limit of divine authority for the government when they start not just governing but ruling, or they usurp godlike prerogatives for themselves. Then they have gone from a position of being not so much a servant, but trying to make themselves a rival to God Almighty. And this is where we segue from Romans 13 to Revelation 13, where John the seer sees the Roman Empire as a beast, a horrible monster, and God's people are persecuted by it, and they can't but wait for the day where this beast is destroyed and given his just deserts.
And this is through the power of God, right? Not through necessarily human power, but through the power of God in Revelation 13.
Yeah, in the scriptural way, it's assumed that God will deal with them. Now, the debate has always been, is that our only remit? I mean, John Calvin said, if you've got a bad prince who's lazy or brutal, all you can do is just pray that God gets rid of them sooner or later. But other people, the Protestant Puritans during the English Civil War and during the American War of Independence said, well, maybe God needs a hand of getting rid of these insolent kings. Maybe God needs a helping hand to get rid of a Charles I or a King George III.
Yeah.
And many people thought, perhaps there is an exception clause to Romans 13.
Yeah.
And maybe that exception is, if the government is good, you don't rebel. But when the government is despotic, then maybe you say, they made kings, but not through me. And maybe there is a way to do it. And in the Christian tradition, as I read it, was very, very hesitant about regicide, killing off the monarch or the ruler. But they said you can get rid of the ruler, but you should do it either peacefully or, get some of the princes of the realm to gang up on him and force him or her out. But generally, Christians have been very, very reluctant to go the path of regicide, just killing off the leader. They think there's other ways to bring about a transition of power.
Yeah. Dr. Michael Bird, that's a really interesting take on this particular passage. I don't know that all of our American friends are going to necessarily agree with you, but there might be some.
If I want to be more contentious, David, I would say put the tea back on the boat and throw the coffee overboard.
You're not
Sit down.
You're not a coffee guy. Come on, we all
I'm
know
not a
that.
coffee down, but I think we can solve all of your problems in America. Throw the coffee away, sit down and have a cup of tea.
A good cup
with
of tea.
King Charles III. Say, look, we made a mistake. We want back into the British Commonwealth, and we'll pay some back taxes for the last 250 years. We'll make it up to you.
Yeah.
But we've been like the prodigal son, running off with our own fantasies of liberty and freedom. We've seen the error of our ways, and now we come crawling back to His Majesty like a wayward son asking to come home. And I think you would be received with open arms, David.
I'm wondering, would we get the ring? Would we get the shoes? Would we get the robe? All of that stuff?
We would kill the fattened calf. We would party hard to see our wayward cousins come back to their senses.
Come back.
But that's a funny thing to imagine.
It is. It is a funny thing to imagine. Let me, before we go, I want to talk about you very quickly and just mention the book that you and Tom Wright have done that sort of deals with what we've been talking about here, Romans 13, among other things. Jesus and the Powers by N.T. Wright and Michael Bird. The subtitle is Christian Political Witness in an Age of Totalitarian Terror and Dysfunctional Democracies. A great book and much to be recommended. Dr. Michael Bird, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, David. Great to be with you and all of your listeners.
Hey, thanks, Mike. It'll be interesting to see what our American audience does with Mike's interpretation of Romans 13. Agree, disagree? Well, make sure you have a reason and it's based in the text itself, not somewhere else. If you want to study Scripture deeply, I have 2 words for you: Wheaton College. Whether you're an undergrad or grad students, they have the right program for you. Go to wheaton.edu and look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. Thanks to our Wheaton-based team and our Houston-based team for helping us produce this podcast. That's all for today. Until next time, I'm David Capes. Thanks for listening.